everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's Wyndham Championship. I'm looking forward to Sedgefield Country Club, which is the home venue for this event, and really because it's unique, it's one of a kind here on the PGA Tour, and really a staple here since, 2008, so almost the 15th year that we've been to Sedgefield. It is a positional track at its finest. Donald Ross, just like we had last week, but the real kicker here is that it's truly tree-lined, so there's not going to be any bombing it over the corner. Guys like a Cameron Young, Tony Finau, who ended up winning last week, are going to be able to utilize that sort of power, and it's no surprise that guys like that aren't even in the field. So if you didn't like last week's, dismantling of an early 1900s golf course, well, Donald Ross is certainly going to get his revenge this week. So in this video, going to cover everything you need to know about this venue, about this track, whether it's from the DFS side or the outright side, covering my key stats, a hole-by-hole analysis of Sedgefield, and at the end also covering a few of the comp courses on the PGA Tour that I use as a comparison to perhaps set a wider baseline for some of the players in your pool, whether it's from the fantasy or the outright betting side. So a lot to talk about, trying to be as informative as possible here in as little time as possible. So let's go ahead and hop right on in. Already, we've got Sedgefield Country Club in Greensboro, North Carolina, designed by Donald Ross way back in 1926. So last week, we obviously had the Rocket Mortgage Classic, Detroit Golf Club, another Donald Ross golf course, but way different looks off the tee here. So first and foremost, I already talked about how they're quote-unquote truly tree-lined here, but I really mean that. The forests here are extremely dense, and you're not dealing with those 20 to 25 foot trees. You're dealing with those 50 to 75, maybe even 100 foot plus tall pine trees that are going to block out any sort of chance of you trying to cut off these dog legs. If you're going to try and get some extra distance out there, you're going to have to work your ball 30, maybe 40 yards in either direction to take on these dog legs. So as a result, like I mentioned, it's a positional track. Players are going to be laying up to the same positions and essentially having the same yardages, both off the tee and into greens as everybody else. And while, sure, the longer hitters are going to be having less club into a lot of the greens, it doesn't make all that much of a difference. And that's why with the winners here over the years, you've seen a lot of shorter hitters have success. And I don't really think that's enough to quantify it, because it's not just been shorter hitters, it's been players in general that have been really good with their wedges, but also solid with some of the shorter irons. So that 100 to 125 yard range, that 125 to 150 yard range, or even that 75 to 100, that feel wedge range, you're going to see a much higher distribution in those proximity buckets than you would on most other PGA Tour courses. And like I mentioned, a lot of that is consistent across the board with how many dog legs you have, how dense a lot of the dog legs force can be. You're not going to see many players pushing it way up there. So as a result, not a surprise that guys like a Tony Finau, a Cameron Young, for example, aren't teeing it up this week, as that's really one of their huge advantages. And at a course like this, you're going to see some of those quote-unquote power players that utilize that week to week maybe struggle a little bit. And when I'm looking for somebody to, from the outright perspective, or somebody that, might be a quote-unquote sleeper pick in a DFS perspective, I'm looking for the guys that don't fit that build, right? The guys that are better course fits. So it's a different week when it comes to that perspective, but there's always a price for everything, right? Just because somebody is a bomber doesn't exclude them from contention here. Of course, like I said, it's more about the short iron play, the wedge play than anything, but in general, and this is just, an overarching type of statement here, the guys that are relatively long off the tee maybe struggle a little bit with the short game, whereas the guys that are a little bit more accurate off the tee tend to, have to make up for it in those type of categories. So that's why I make that sort of statement, but let's go ahead and hop into the details. So first and foremost, a par 70, 7,131 yards, and you'll notice that a lot of players here are going to be hitting to the same spots. So, really distance here isn't all that important. Pretty much every single hole is going to be gettable with a mid-iron at the very most, and the two par 5s on property, because it is a par 70, there will only be 2 on the docket, are extremely gettable. Both feature over 50% birdie rates and are going to be reachable by every single player in the field, and that is non-exclusive. Pretty much anybody that can hit it over 280 yards off the tee should be able to get home in 2 here. The 2021 scoring average was minus 1.12 strokes under par, which was nearly zero point 0.7 strokes easier than the tour average. And believe it or not, last year was one of the harder iterations of this event. So, in years past, it's gone closer to 1.5 strokes under par, 1.4 strokes under par. So pretty similar to what we saw the week before at the Rocket Mortgage Classic, which is truly a birdie fest at its finest. And here in 2022, while the weather conditions are going to be a huge factor, whether it plays a little bit more like last year or a little bit more like we've seen in years past, in either circumstance, you're looking at a golf tournament, we're going to see plenty of low scores to be had, and perhaps something even close to a 59 like we've seen around this track. In terms of penalty strokes per round, it's only 0.27, so that's a whole 0.14 less than the tour average, so a pretty easy golf course when it comes to hitting it into hazards. Really, you're a lot more worried about taking unplayables here than anything. There's not that much water on property. There are a few water hazards that come into play, but like I said, if you hit it into some of those dense forest, you could very well be re-teeing. So that's where you see a lot of those penalty strokes. The greens here are right about tour average when it comes to their size. They are 6,000 square foot per green. The GIR percentage in 2021 was 76.3%. So, despite being tour average with their size, they were hit 8.1% more than tour average. And you may ask yourself, why would that be the case if they're about, average when it comes to their size? Well, two reasons. First and foremost, last year, it played firm and fast. So it wasn't because they were more receptive. In fact, if anything, they were slightly less receptive last year than they have been in years past. The real reason is the lack of length, right? It's a 7,100-yard golf course. And even if you're laying up off the tee, hitting something like a driving iron or a 3-wood, like I mentioned, you're going to have like mid-iron or wedges at most into these greens. And when you're giving a tour player a wedge, they're going to hit the green a lot more often than not. So the GAR percentage is a lot higher here than tour average, but don't get it wrong, these still are relatively small targets. They can play firm and fast like we saw in 2021, but it really doesn't make all that much a difference. Last year, they ran right around 12s on the stint meter. Again, a little bit firmer and faster last year than we've seen in years past, and they are a championship Bermuda grass, which, Bermuda, first time you've seen the surface for quite some time. So if you're pulling up Bermuda numbers from this year, just recognize you're probably getting them from the fall swing or early spring season at the very earliest. But when we look at a long-term Bermuda sample size, it tends to be by far one of the most predictive surfaces. You deal with grain change on Bermuda. It's what I'm used to down here in Florida on most of the golf courses. And guys that have that familiarity with reading the grain are going to have a great ability to make putts this week because it helps you make the reads. A lot of times the grain goes down when it's going down slope. Obviously with water running off, that's the cause for that. That's why grain happens to grow in the way it does. Also with how they're cutting them on the surfaces, most of the people that are, cutting greens will go down grain, right? For that reason to, kind of go with the track of the grass. Now, I'm no agronomics guy, so I can't give you the specifics there, but the guys that have that familiarity are going to have a lot of success this week. So I'm definitely looking at a long-term sample size with Bermuda putting. Even though we haven't seen it of late, it's definitely something that has paid dividends in the past. I'm trying to take guys that are specialists because, like I said, it's the most predictive surface when it comes to that familiarity. Next up, we've got the fairways, which are right around 29 yards wide. And I mentioned this factor a little bit earlier. They play even smaller. So though they are 29 yards wide, which is a whole almost 6 yards thinner than tour average, so they're already thin to begin with, they play closer to like 24, 25 yards. You have all these overhanging limbs on pretty much every single hole, where if you hit it to, let's say, the left 3 to 5 yards or the right 3 to 5 yards in any one fairway, you might not have any shot into the green. You might be just trying to pitch it out to a position where you can try and get up and down for par. It is one of those golf courses. So when you look at the fairway percentage, it was 68.7%, which was 2.8% higher than the tour average. Just understand that this is a hard golf course off the tee, especially when it comes to driving accuracy. It was only higher than tour average because of so many people laying up off the tee. And sure, when you're hitting an iron off the tee, it's not very hard to hit a fairway, right? It's just like the GIR percentage being higher than tour average. It's not that hard to hit greens, even when they're average sized, when you're hitting a wedge into every single green, right? Driving iron off the tee, it's easy to hit those fairways. It's that same type of effect. So understand that they are relatively small surfaces. The guys that are elite driving accuracy guys, tend to gain a lot more strokes off the tee here than the guys that are relatively long off the tee because they don't miss a fairway all week. I mean, you might legitimately see guys that go out there, hit 11, 12 fairways out of 14 on the round and have a lot of success in that fashion. And they are also Bermuda grass. The fairways, the rough is Bermuda. It's 2.5 inches, and it last year played a relatively large penalty. Played to a relatively large penalty. It played to a .43 stroke penalty there in 2021, and that was despite only being 3 inches long by the weekend. So you're dealing with a similar situation this year. I'd imagine they're not going to cut it very much throughout the event. And anytime you have Bermuda, it's a lot harder to hit out of than any other rough. The second hardest would be a bluegrass rough, I would say, at least in my personal opinion. Kikuyu can be a little bit tricky to hit out of there on the west coast, but by far the most difficult is Bermuda. And when you get like 4-inch Bermuda grass, forget it. I mean, it's almost impossible to hit out of. I mean, we saw that at the Wells Fargo Championship. There was a mix between Bermuda and bluegrass, which, both of the two hardest surfaces that wasn't easy to hit out of. But when you get pure Bermuda grass rough, oh boy, I mean, it can really be tricky. I can just tell you from down in Florida, it's not the most pleasant thing to hit out of. In fact, most golf courses down here cut it down to like half an inch or an inch rough at the very most. They don't even want people messing with it. It can be that difficult. So it'll definitely play a factor. It's just an even larger reason why hitting fairways, being somebody that's positional off the tee, is going to be advantage around this track. In terms of weather, because it's so tree lined, you're not going to see a massive effect with the wind. Most holes are going to be sheltered from that effect. And while there are a few holes that are a little bit more exposed, and you can see that type of effect, pretty much no matter the weather conditions we've had around the Wyndham Championship, it plays as a birdie fest, right? Maybe rather than playing a stroke and a half under par per round, it plays closer to a stroke under par with something like 15 to 20 mile an hour winds, but it's not something I'm taking all that seriously. And in terms of elevation change, there's not much in the Greensboro area. It's more of a hilly area than anything. You'll get a few tee boxes that will be elevated, but outside of that, you're not going to be dealing with a ton of undulation in the fairways, not a ton of blind shots uphill, not a ton of like 10 to 20 yard shots downhill, that sort of thing. It's a little bit more of a straightforward golf course than maybe what we saw over there in the Midwest swing, or even up there in the Northeast, like the Travelers Championship, where there can be quite a little bit of tricky terrain out there. All right, now going hole by hole. This golf course, like I mentioned, extremely gettable, especially when you look at it from an overhead perspective, right? And you're assuming that they're hitting perfect drives. But understand, particularly in some of these tree-lined holes, there are a lot of big numbers out there. I mean, you could be going 6, 7 under par through your first 14 or 15 holes and end up at something like 2 to 3 under par. That is certainly within the cards if you get a little bit hairy off the tee. So first off, hole number one of the few holes you don't really got to worry about it off the tee. There is a large landing area, of course, a fairway bunker, a few trees to the left, but most players will bail out to the right if anything. It's a relatively small landing area if you do end up hitting driver. So a lot of guys will end up just hitting iron off the first tee, setting up something like a mid-iron in. So you'll see most guys I'll get out there to like a 250 yard shot off the tee. That's like a 4, 6, 5 iron, something in that range for these players, and then have something like a 9 or 8 iron in. So it's going to be a relatively gettable hole for anybody. Now, if you want to be a little bit aggressive here, and if you're a great off the tee player, you might get this hole and then maybe 1 or 2 other holes where you can actually be a little bit aggressive. I just don't know how much it pays off, right? You can get it up there, maybe 320 yards. You're still left with a 90-yard wedge shot, which when you're comparing a 90 to a 120-yard wedge shot, it's really not all that much of a difference. In fact, you're going to have some players out there that prefer the full pitching wedge or the full gap wedge rather than that little field wedge shot from 90 yards 10 out of 10 times, because they have those 120, 130, 140 yard numbers dialed in like the back of their hand, whereas those field shots can be exactly that, a field shot, a little bit more inconsistent. So perhaps that's where you start to see the positional effects start to play here, where guys that are used to having to play this method go out there, be a little bit more conservative off the tee, are going to have a little bit more success actually putting it into practice. So that's something I wanted to show with hole number 1, because it does give you a pretty solid idea of what to expect at almost every hole here. Hole number 2 is 437. It's another positional hole, relatively large fairway compared to most of them out there. While it does dogleg from left to right, that adds a little bit of difficulty with hitting this fairway. You're setting up another mid-iron or even a pitching wedge at the very most into this green. So I should say at the very least into this green, right? You're not going going to have like a field wedge shot in, but if you're a little bit more aggressive off the tee, right, you have 122 in, right? That's a pitching wedge. You might even have a gap wedge for one of these bombers. Another hole where you hit it in the fairway, you're definitely looking at a birdie look. Hole 3 is 172 yards. It is a par 3. Like most Donald Ross greens, it does slope heavily from back to front. So depending on pin location, over that front left bunker can be a little bit more accessible than you expect because it's only 172 yards. Because you do have that back to right on back to front slope, you're hitting, let's say, probably a 7-iron for most of these players, an 8-iron at most, into some of these greens. You can get some backspin, especially with that back to front slope, and access some of those pins. So it's not very difficult. The par 3s here are definitely a lot more gettable than most Donald Ross designs. Hole 4 is 424 yards. Pretty standard hole around here. You do have a heavy tree line on the left, so it is one of the few areas of the golf course where if you end up hitting a duck hook or severely, misjudging a slice or something like that, if you're a lefty, you could get into a lot of trouble. But a lot of players will just bail out to the right, access this green with a wedge, and get out of there with a birdie look. Hole 5 is 522 yards. It is a par 5, so going to be gettable by the entire field. And you do have a large landing area. Even with the rough here, you do have probably a good 10-15 yard buffer on either side, which is why this is so gettable, right? If it was a par 5 with the trees right on the fairway, like you'll see here for especially on the back 9, it'd be a completely different story. But you have a solid buffer on either direction, right, left or right. So players, even if they're in the rough here, they should be able to advance it pretty far out of this 2.5-inch Bermuda grass rough, and at the most have a wedge in. If not, obviously you hit the fairway. You have a 240-yard shot into this green. It's relatively flat. You're going to see plenty of eagles here at hole number 5. Hole 6 is 420 yards. It's positional at its best. You have to lay up here. You're pretty much not going to see anybody trying to hit it over the stream. So most players will just lay up to this large landing area with an iron, have something like a 8 or 7 iron in, and again, another birdie look. It's just going to get extremely redundant out here. You can see why the scoring average, despite having all this trouble off the tee, is as low as it is. It's just, hit irons off the tee, sometimes a 3-wood at the very most, and then have something like an 8 or a 9 iron in, literally for almost every single hole. Hole 7 is a par 3. It is 224 yards, so it's on the longer end of the spectrum when it comes to par 3s on tour, but a huge green, at least comparatively for the rest of the golf course. It looks like an aircraft carrier out there compared to some of the other greens. It's sloped from back to front, so as long as it's not like on the back edge, actually, if it's on the back edge, it isn't even that hard to get there anyways. This isn't that difficult, despite being over 200 yards. Hole number 8 is 370. It is potentially drivable, and I mentioned that because longer hitters like a Keith Mitchell this week might take a sniff at it, but for most guys in the field, it'll just be an iron or a 3-wood off the tee, get to this second fairway, and then have a flip wedge in. Now, if you're going to be aggressive about it, let's see, up here to the choke point, it's 313 yards. So you might see a few of the accurate drivers try and take a 3-wood or maybe even a driver out here to this little corner and really set up a flip wedge. But to get it on the green, you got to have like 320, 330 yards to get up there. Only the actual longest players on tour, and it's uphill too. You can see it's a solid 330 yards uphill. It's 330 plus 30 yards uphill. That's a difficult task for sure. So I'd expect most players to, if anything with driver, probably take it to right around here, which, let's see, it's playing right around still plays 366 yards right there. So you can see, because it's so far uphill, it's not the easiest prospect to get it up there and get it rolling down to the green. So most players here will probably be a little bit less aggressive. Maybe Keith Mitchell takes it down to their choke point, take it out here to the fat part of the fairway. Hole 9 is 415 yards. It's a short par 4. It's got a massive green. You can see it the whole way from here. It's one of the larger targets out here. So if we go here to the green, you'll see it's large and it's also extremely wide. It's a very easy target to hit. Now, obviously, if they're tucking it to the left or the right side, some of the turtle shell type of undulations where you have these chipping areas to the left and right do come into play, but because it's such a short hole, you're going to see plenty of birdies at hole number 9. Hole 10 is 437 off the tee. You do have that fairway bunker on the left side that can gobble up some shots. You do have that forest down the right, which, if you end up missing to the right, you can see it's only like a 5 to 7 yard buffer between the fairway right here and then what you're getting into the trees. You can start to see the effect of the tree-lined fairways very quickly here, right? If you end up missing on the right side of the fairway, you're probably going to have to hit a punch shot that runs up onto the green, which is far from ideal. So the guys that can get it out there towards the left half of the fairway are going to have a lot more success. Hole number 11 is a 480-yard par 4, so I believe it's the longest par 4 on property. It's not that difficult because it is a little bit more open off the tee. You can see with the par 5s here and then the longer par 4s, they do give you a little bit more room off the tee. But with the shorter ones, you're going to get screwed with how tight some of them can be, right? They try and really penalize you for missing on those shorter par 4s. You have a little bit more leeway here. So it is a longer hole, but it's still gettable because of how wide it is off the tee. Hole 12 is 244 yards, so this is the longest of the par 3s. So the 224-yard one is second. This is the longest on property. It is a relatively thin green, too. So unlike the other par 3, it's not as big of a surface. You can see it's almost like they cut this in half, right? In the front here, it's a dead drop-off zone right here. So it can play extremely difficult right here. So it's definitely not a gettable hole. And you can see like they almost cut the green in half, which to me is a little bit amusing, especially when you're looking at it from an overhead view. Hole 13 is less than 400 yards, extremely gettable, dogleg from right to left. Fairway bunkers don't really come into play, particularly if you're laying up off the tee like most players will. And frankly, because of the fairway bunkers, the rough up there, how narrow that landing area is, there's no reason to take driver here, right? Just hit it in the fairway, hit a wedge in there, and you're looking at a birdie. Look, hole 14 is 496. It is actually it's even longer than 483 yards, but I believe they don't play it from the whole back tees here. At least from the scorecard yardage last year, I believe they maybe even played these tees, which is like 475 yards. Either circumstance, though, it's still going to be a relatively gettable hole. The main thing that we're looking at here, let's go ahead and just look at the green. Let's go the whole way up here. The green's relatively large, but it does, instead of going from back to front, it tilts from like back left to front left. Back left to front right, which means that this bunker over here gets a ton of attention, particularly when you get a front right pin location. A lot of people that end up overdoing a slice will end up into that bunker there. People that are just miss 4 to 5 feet right of this pin are going to be in quite a bit of trouble. But if you can get it to the right of this pin, right, with a front right pin location, you're putting right uphill. You're going to be in a great spot to go out there and make birdie. That's one of the few risk reward holes that I like. And then over this green, it's absolute death. There's actually some fescue, some of the deeper rough on property is first off around that tee box right there. You can see it there. It's a little bit longer, but over this green as well. And because everything in O'Donnell Ross design, in general goes from back to front, also in this case from left to right, up and down to one of these back pins is impossible. So this is a hole like, kind of like the 480-yard par 4 that we saw a few holes ago, you just don't want to mess around with, right? You just get it on the surface in 2 putts, a relatively large green, and get on out of your way, because pretty much every other hole is gettable, just like hole 15, which is a 542-yard par 5. It should be gettable by most of the field. You do have to hit a good drive here to get home in 2. And for your second shot, you also can't go to sleep, right? Obviously, there's a lake there. It's one of the few holes where water comes into play. You're going to see it over the next few holes. There's a little bit of water there, but should be gettable in 2 for most of the field with a good drive, and features an over 50% birdie rate. Hole 16 is another hole with quote-unquote water in play, but it's not really, right? These players would have to really mishit it to end up in that lake. It's 180 yards. It's not that long, so compared to the 224, 240-yard par 3s, it's an afternoon snack, kind of comparable to the 172 that we saw early in the day. But yeah, plenty of birdies are going to be had here, and the water's more aesthetic than anything. It's not really in play. Hole 17 is a 400-yard par 4, another just standard hole around the Wyndham Championship. You do have a tree-lined fairway. You do have a little bit more room here than some of the tighter holes on property, so it isn't all that bad, right? Hole 17, meant to be a little bit of a moving spot, especially coming down the stretch on a Saturday or Sunday, and you could definitely see plenty of birdies there. Now, lastly, the hardest hole on property is hole 18, so they do end it up right. They will play it from the tips, but the one thing I'll say is that it plays a little bit downhill, so you can see the elevation change is about 10 yards from tee to fairway here, so hitting it out there 310, 320 yards is certainly possible. In fact, you might see some guys get it close to this little gully down here. It's not really a river. It's more of like a drainage ditch than anything, but you don't want to be in there. It's usually a little bit wet, unlike the one on 18 that we saw this week. But get it out there like 320 yards with that elevation change, and what? You have 160 yards in. Really not all that bad. Now, it does play back up the hill, so you go down the hill, then back up the hill. So it's playing actually 150 yards of true distance, but closer to 163 yards in actual adjusted distance. So it can be a little bit tricky. It's like the only hole in property with a significant amount of elevation change. You also don't want to miss left here. This forest has gobbled up plenty of players in past and caused trouble. And you will see plenty of guys just bail out to the right. So the miss here is going to be over here to the right. Having like 190 yards in, which sucks. Like if you get into this Bermuda grass rough, you're playing uphill to a green where you can't really see, especially like a back left pin location. You really got to hit the fairway here. So hole 18 definitely can cause some drama. It's a good thing that they put the most difficult hole on property there for us on the last hole. Now that we've seen the golf course, let's go through my key stats for analysis this week, what I'm using to identify my top plays at the Wyndham. So first and foremost, we've got shots gained approach, which should not surprise anybody. It's by far the most consistent stat from week to week on tour, but also the stat, especially at a short golf course, that really makes or breaks the field. When you have a lot of wedge shots, those 125 to 150 or those 150 to 175 yard approach shots, you're going to have plenty of 10 to 15 footers. And just setting up a ton of birdie opportunities is definitely an avenue to success. In fact, the guys that have won around this venue have been elite in all three of those categories. So I'm not just looking at shots gained approach, but I am looking at those short iron, those wedge ranges that, obviously from the hole by hole breakdown, you saw just how overutilized they're going to be. And that is going to be one of the key tenets to my modeling this week. So that should not be a surprise there. Pretty much every single week, shots gained approach is going to be here in the top 3. At number 2, though, mixing it up a little bit, we've got driving accuracy percentage, which definitely, isn't something I feature too often here on the channel, but just based on how positional this track is, the fact that driver pretty much gets taken out of your hand on at least half the holes around this venue, it's definitely something to look at least in my opinion. With how penal the rough can be, again, right around a 0.4 shot penalty for hitting it in that 2.5-inch Bermuda grass rough, also going to be a factor from that perspective. So for me, driving accuracy going to be a way I can get to some of those shorter, a little bit more strategic players that are used to playing this brand of golf, right? The guys that are driving accuracy heavy players tend to, kind of tone it down off the tee a little bit. They tend to hit a lot of fairways and try to set up angles into greens, right? The guys that are elite accuracy guys can not only just hit fairways, they can choose which part of the fairway to hit it to, right? Like Brendan Todd, for example, is infamous with his caddy for talking about, okay, which part of the fairway are we hitting this to, and hitting it there almost every single time. He'll go like left center or like just left of left center of the fairway, and he'll hit it there almost every single time. Guys like that are going to be in the mayor's office for almost every single hole, right? And obviously on the par 3s, they don't get that advantage. But for 14 of the holes around the track, they're going to be in prime position, right? Those guys like Keith Mitchell, Rory McIlroy, if he was playing this event, are going to be able to unleash that big dog on them, right? And if they're going to have a golf course where they're, from fairway in going to be in the same position as everybody else, they should be licking their chops. So driving accuracy, a good way to get to those type of players. Next up, we've got shots gained putting on Bermuda. So like I mentioned, it is extremely predictive. At least a player's long-term Bermuda grass putting baseline is extremely predictive week to week on tour, particularly for a bounce back performance. So if there's guys coming in with horrible putting form, but historically they are great on Bermuda grass, I'm going to love them this week. In fact, I'm almost going to completely forgive some of those players. When you get them on a grainy Bermuda surface, they're able to see a lot of the breaks just inherently with their eyes. They don't have to look at the actual slope, look at the surrounding type of foliage to get an idea. A lot of them are going to make a lot more putts this week. So guys like Patton Kizzire, for example, who is the Bermuda grass whisperer, could definitely be worth a few looks at this type of track. Those type of guys that have that ability long term. So that's something that I'm looking at for sure. But outside of those top 3 key stats, I'm looking at shots gained around the green. It has proven to be extremely important around this venue, particularly for winners, which might be a little bit surprising, particularly with the high GAR percentage. But look at winners like a Henrik Stenson, Patrick Reed. Definitely makes a lot of sense for those winners. You have par 4 scoring, which I'm using this week with the extra 2 par 4s. We're also looking at shots gained at our comp courses, which we'll talk about here in a second. Quite a few comps that I like around the PGA Tour. Birdie or better percentage is always important at easy golf courses, and this definitely qualifies as an easy track. Course history around Wyndham Championship has proven to be important over the years. Guys that have had success at this venue seem to have continued success over the years. We're also taking a look at shots gained for courses under 7,150 yards. So taking a look at a historical baseline there. And lastly, shots gained at Donald Ross designs, which on the PGA Tour, there are 3 of them. What we had last week at the Rocket Mortgage for Detroit Golf Club, this week, and then lastly at the Tour Championship at East Lake, another Donald Ross design. So players that have had success at all 3 tracks are also going to get a boost in my modeling. All right, and now lastly for our comp courses. At number 1, we're going to have Harbor Town Golf Links, the home of the RBC Heritage, a track where everybody talks about the overhanging limbs. It's positional. It's all about just hitting fairways and then hitting greens and making putts. Seems like a relatively simple way to break down a golf course, but it's our bread and butter, right? Get guys that are super accurate, that are, hot with the putter or tend to putt well on Bermuda grass. And that's what we do at Harbor Town. And frankly, that's what we do at the Wyndham Championship. And it has been extremely successful over the years. So in terms of crossover, there has been plenty in terms of winners and top 5 finishers. Guys like Webb Simpson, for example, has been unbelievable at both golf courses. So that shouldn't be a surprise for anybody there at number 1. Next up, we've got the Sea Island Seaside course. So obviously there are 2 tracks on the Rotunda, but the Seaside course is a par 70 right around 7,000 yards. So a short positional track where it's more of a link setup because it is on the ocean, a little bit more exposed to the elements. You will get plenty of, 20, 30 mile an hour days that really impact the scoring average. So I don't like it from that perspective. Around the Wyndham Championship in Sedgefield, all of those trees kind of act as a shield to some of the elements. I like the fact that, a lot of the shots are the same, right? It's going to be extremely positional. You're going to be having a lot of mid to short irons or wedges into almost every single green. And much like we saw at Harbor Town, a lot of crossover with players that have played well around those tracks. So the guys that have historically taken apart these 7,200 yard or less golf courses are definitely going to be worth a few looks, at least in my opinion. So another one of those tracks that checks off that box. And lastly, now we don't have a large sample size here, but TPC Potomac at Avenel Farm, so the home of the Wells Fargo Championship this year. It was another Bermuda grass setup. They did have bent grass green, so it was a little bit different there, but and remember, it was the Bermuda grass / bent grass, bluegrass rough. So it's, a little bit different, but you're still talking about that Bermuda grass catching your clubs. But most importantly, a par 70 was right around 7,000 yards. So another track that fits that same type of description. And we do have the stats from just, like a couple months ago to pull from to go off of for the recent form. So I don't hate it whatsoever. It is my 3rd comp course there. There are a few others that I was considering, a few other short par 71s or short par 70s on the PGA Tour. But these 3 were definitely the top in my perspective. All right, boys, that is all I've got for the course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and let me know what you think the winning score is going to be this week. For me, I'm going to take 19 under par. I could see it being a little bit easier than that. A lot of it comes down to weather, so if you want my actual opinion, come by on Wednesday when we have a better idea of that. But also, before you hop on out of here, go ahead and smash that like button. It does a lot of help here with helping me grow the channel. Also shows me that you support the content, enjoy what you're seeing. So if you haven't done so already, first off, what are you doing? But make sure you go ahead and do that as well. We will have plenty of content dropping throughout the week, including DFS core picks, which will be dropping this afternoon there for the Wyndham Championship on Draftkings. We'll have our fades and sleepers. Our weekly DFS live stream will be Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So look forward to all of that. And again, if you haven't subscribed as well, I would highly recommend you do that too. That way you don't miss any of that content when that drops, and you get notifications there too. I appreciate all the support, guys. Best of luck from the outright perspective, your DFS perspective, if you're going in that direction, and let's get this cash.